Cravon Studios, and in this shop talk, I want to talk to you a little bit about movement and movement styles in board games. Now, there's a few styles of movement in board games. I think some of the existing ones are a bit too restrictive or don't really cover some of the things, but here's the way I break it up in my head and kind of what I'm thinking about when I look at different movement styles. This is a bit of an overview. In other shop talks, we might go into depth on how each of these is used, but this will give you an idea for the different kinds of movement you're probably going to see in board games. The first one, and probably the easiest one, is path-based movement. It's kind of like a linear movement where there's one path and one path only. You kind of go through that path, either forward or backwards. There's no right-left, very little of that. There's not very much branching or freedom of movement. A really common example of something of like path-based movement would be Candyland or Life, even Monopoly. These are more common in roll and move style games, and it tends to be driving you towards a goal. Like this path is going to lead you to a particular goal, and it tends to represent a progression and different things that will happen along that. Taekwondo, in some respects, would be a path-based one with branches, but there tends to be this one string and one way to move throughout the game. The other one is another one is grid-based movement. Now, grid-based movement, think about graph paper, a map of graphs. Some people consider things like Chinese checkers or other games like that a grid-based movement, but that's not really the case. Technically, the definition of a grid is a tessellated pattern of squares or rectangles. So you can move front, back, left, and right. That's about it for a grid. So grid-based movement's been, very popular in board games for a long time. Checkers and chess are based on grid-based movement. Now, admittedly, some of the pieces can go diagonally, like bishops, or in checkers, your checkers go diagonally, but you're still moving on a grid and your movement is fairly limited. But grid was the first attempt at like two-dimensional mapping that allowed you more freedom of movement. It allowed you to go pretty much any direction you wanted, either zigzagging for diagonals or whatever, but it didn't worry about facing too much, what direction you were facing. Kind of had front, back, left, and right, which was okay. Dungeons & Dragons used graph paper and graph paper maps in early modules for a really long time. It was very familiar to people. Eventually, they went to outdoor mapping. And outdoor mapping, they went to a slightly more easier to turn and navigate and system of movement for hexes. But we're going to talk about hexes next. The thing about grid-based movement is it gives you more directions, and facing can make a difference. Now, if you think about hexes, you have many directions to go, but in a grid you really don't. Okay, so it's a bit more restrictive, but it's very easy to understand and very easy to draw, right? So let's talk about hexes. Now, hex-based movement was kind of the first real attempt we had at semi-realistic movement, or used in games where facing made a difference. Battletech's a classic example of this. Your mech can be facing on one face of the hex, but the torso can be rotated so you face a different direction on the hex. And hexes give you, 6 directions of movement, which allows for better turning, facing, and movement options. The other advantage of hexes is, of course, it is also a tessellating pattern. And I'll talk about tessellation in a minute and why we use that. But a tessellated pattern means we can have a nice, even, two-dimensional map with a single shape. Okay. Now, hexes themselves, the outdoor maps in D&D went to hexes. I mentioned Battletech before. It's fairly common in a lot of miniature-based games. Okay. If you want to consider grids like the 8-bit equivalent of board game movement, hexes would be the 16-bit equivalent of board game movement. A little more fidelity, a little finer grained, a little more control, if you want to look at it that way. Beyond that, we also have movement for areas. Now, area movement, and I mentioned area control in the last video, but area movement, the shapes aren't necessarily even, they're not necessarily the same, they don't necessarily represent scale, or a linear scale, or an actual scale. If you look at different games like Risk or any other game that's got just chunks carved out of the board, that's area movement. You move from one area to an adjacent area. It may be north-south, it may be a little bit off. Some areas will have 6 sides, some areas may only have 4. But it's mostly to represent locations where things happen. as opposed to representing how far you have traveled. Hexes and grids allow for that counting of distance more so than area does. If you look at a lot of area-based boards, you may have a section that's very small, and it takes you just as long to cross that section as it does one that's this wide. So it doesn't really represent realistic distance or time-based movement. However, you don't need to worry about that too much, because area-based boards are usually to define where something happens, where a resource is located that you have to capture, or something like where if two units are in the same area, right? So if we want to look, we've got grids, hexes, and area, okay? And that will basically help you kind of understand where these things go and kind of a comparison of them and some of the common games that use them, all right? So the other thing we have in addition to these is free movement or template-based movement. Now, free movement, there are no marks in the map. As you can see in this image, there's nothing there. And that's probably the ultimate in movement freedom. You're able to go any direction you want to. You're able to turn any direction you want to. But measuring distances and seeing how far you can go is a little more challenging. So what games that use this, for example, Warhammer 40K, or a lot of battle reenactment games use, are measuring devices. They're either fixed length sticks or cardboard templates or string or even measuring tape. Line of sight is determined by string or laser pointer or the edge of a ruler. So you have like the ultimate freedom as far as facing and movement goes and where you're going to go. But the actual measurement of that movement and tracking that becomes a little more tedious because of the extra tools involved. A subset of this free movement is template-based movement. And most common example of that is X-Wing. It's a very popular game. There are probably others out there that do this, but I think that X-Wing is a great example of this. You put the template that you're going to use to move at the front of the base of your miniature. You lay the template down there, and then you move the miniature so the back of the base touches the end of the template. And then you've just done your movement. This kind of system allows you to play on any play surface. It could be a gaming table. It could be a carpet. Anywhere you can play. As long as you have the templates and the measuring tools, you can lay out your miniature battle, which makes it very handy. Those are basically the categories I break this up into. Now, I mentioned earlier about tessellation and why you might want to use hexes and grids. Hexes and grids are two of about 4 two-dimensional shapes that tessellate with what we call regular tessellation. That just means that you can draw these with the shapes touching each other and there are no gaps. It creates a two-dimensional pattern where there are no gaps that lets you create maps. And if you remember these images, right, the area one, you can't do that with because the shapes are irregular and you might have gaps. So you just draw things that fill in, but it's not an even pattern, whereas the grids and the hexes are even patterns. There are other shapes that tessellate, for example, triangles and diamonds, but they're not real popular in board games. The diamond one tends to be from like Cubert, which is just a tessellated pattern of diamonds, right? So anyway, that's movement, tessellation, kind of what it's about. There's a little more detail and some images on our blog post associated with this episode. So for those of you who couldn't see the images, which are anybody on the audio portion, have a look at the video and we'll put links, cross links to all this in there. So thanks again for watching, and until the next Shop Talk, I'm Rocky Heckman, and I'll see you later.